guys, and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface Lesson 12. In this lesson we're going to continue on from Lesson 11, creating the Ironman MK7 bust. Now whereas last time I kind of went into some more serious detail on the helmet, trying to get all the proportions correct and getting some of the smoothing and angles narrowed down. In this lesson, I'm going to kind of move away from that workflow now that the helmet is done and I've got a kind of accurate reference of which to base those proportions off. We're going to go in and actually make the blocking out for the rest of the bust itself. Then in the last lesson, I'll go in and refine and add any of the small details to this blocking out. So it could be a long lesson and I might need to break it up into two parts. But basically the goal here is to finish off blocking all the pieces off with a basic kind of topological flow that might not work with the Turbo Smooth applied, but is set up so that when I do need to go in and add some hard edges and beveling and insets, the topology is flowing in the right direction so that it's actually easy to kind of narrow that down. Now, it's not often I usually work like this, but the reason I'm going to do it this way for this lesson is because it can become quite tedious for someone who's less experienced to actually figure out if all the details are correct without seeing more of the model blocked out. Now that just comes from experience. So basically, as I modeled originally, the way I learned how to model, I didn't really have a lot of patience. So like I said, I would do things like I did in the last lesson, just trying to narrow down piece by piece. What can happen though is, and I've actually seen it from a couple of you guys posting your work to me, is that you lose the proportions because you're so focused on little small details looking right, you've missed the fact that the overall scale and angle of some edges is completely off. Now, as you know, whenever you're working on a car or something robotic, if one angle's off, pretty much all the other angles are off too, because they all have to kind of meet and flow off of each other. You know, if one edge isn't lining up and then you move to the next, it can kind of compound the issue. So I'm going to prevent that, and this lesson we're just going to see how the topology for something like this will look while trying to keep it low res enough where it's easy to understand what's going on, and also easy enough to make some adjustments if I have made some mistakes when I need to go in and create some of those hard bevels. Because what can happen is when you block out a mesh, you're not always looking at it from the finished result point of view, and if you miss having, like, say, a certain inset in the right area, all of a sudden the topology doesn't start connecting to the piece next to it. And you know what that means is sometimes you can go in and be required to actually add edge loops to the connecting pieces after you've already gone in and made sure the smoothing is right on that piece, and then you've got to rejig all those points again to get things smoothing out. So I'm going to start off with the hardest piece on the surface in terms of how different edges are hitting each other, and that's this piece here, this kind of shoulder brace area. So because we've got a flat surface on the side, I'm going to start with that and kind of disregard the fact that there's two different types of metal connecting on this, and I'm just going to try and make it one big piece, and then later on I'll go in and cut in these silver details into the topology once I've got the simpler, less detailed version blocked out. You can see up the top here as the shoulder rolls in, the curve kind of flows off, but on the metal piece that kind of rotates around this direction. So there's going to be some little tricks to get that looking nice. But I'll start out just by kind of creating a very simple shape and cut into it. So as usual, I'm just going to start with a simple plane, one by one, and I'm just going to drag this out to the left, and I'm going to rotate it. Now the widest part on the shoulder is generally going to be, where the edge is on the front blueprint. So I'm just going to move that to the edge here, and then I'm going to try and determine how far back that actually goes. Now we can't see, if you see on the right here, there's this silver attachment. We can't actually see that on the front-on blueprint, so I know from that that it's generally going to be just a little bit further behind the, like a little bit on the center from the side-on point of view. So from here, I'm just going to pull this vertice up to the base, and I'm going to align these two vertices up here. And I'm going to pull that down to the point where this rolls off, which generally goes about here. Now I'm going to connect along the side and just start pulling this up into place. And because the angle on that alignment was correct, I don't need to move this left and right. I'm just going to stick with that being there for now. And now that we've got that very first initial kind of angle set up correctly, I can just drag this out and we can work a little bit more quickly from this point. Now you notice I'm keeping things quite low. At this point I'm going to turn on Turbo Smooth. Now this is only going to be to make sure that the amount of topology I've got kind of spread out the back here is high res enough. Now generally when I'm blocking something out, I'll go half as high as it actually needs to be. So for the final, there'll be an extra connection running down each one of these edge rings. So then I can just go flow connect, and that will be the final like level of detail on that. I'm going to add a second edge loop here because you can see that it's not so soft in this area and it kind of hardens off. All I'm trying to do is just get this outer edge lined up. Now if any of these angles along this kind of inner edge aren't working, I'm just going to start pulling those in. And now I can grab this entire inside edge and I'm going to shift drag this towards the center. And I'm going to drag that out twice. You can see from side on here, even though this edge kind of is sitting on the blueprint, up here it actually goes a little bit further up to here. So I need to raise this a bit higher, like so. And for the back, because I'm not going to work on the back at the start, I'm just going to leave that for now and just kind of keep everything in line. I'm going to drag this vertice out to this hard edge point. Might need one more edge down here, and I can just flow connect that. Now if the distribution isn't perfectly aligned in the center here, as usual I'm just swapping between the edge constraint toggle, so I can turn that on and just slide it down. So now I'm going to select the back, and you can see what's happening at the front here is this back detail is kind of getting in the way of how we perceive what's going on in all this front area. So I'm going to detach that for now. I'll reattach it later once I go in and set up the back blueprint. You can see right here that it's in the scene, but it just hasn't been aligned correctly. So rather than going back and forth and constantly hiding the front blueprint, I'm just going to get all the front details working, and then we'll swap to the back and start blocking those out. Now, generally speaking, in the blocking out stage, you can just kind of keep the topology flowing from one piece to the next. So for this next part, I'm going to drag out on the front chest area. And I'm just going to do that from the side first, because you can see we don't have things fully aligned yet. So I'm just going to move those into position. And now I'm going to drag out one edge loop and then another, and I can just delete this ring, this loop in the center, this ring. Now from here, just very quickly, I'm not going to, you can see the angle I've got here, I'm not going to cut into that, because I'm going to try and make sure that from the side it is set up on the right angle. What can happen is if I start connecting these points like so, I might not fully know where that point sits in space. Because if I've got this point here and I know there's that perfect alignment between the area I just deleted, later on what I can do is I can actually cut this detail out like so. So I'm just going to leave that for now and just start working on dragging out the rest of this point. I'm going to delete this edge on the side. And I can just start dragging down. So I'm going to center this middle piece right on 0. And now you can see we've got a situation where we need to flow this kind of inwards. So to do that, I'm just going to cut once on the center of the polygon and then back towards the intersection. And I'm going to put this on 0. Now I'm going to do the same here, and just simply delete this inside face. Now just because it's on this point here and it's not really the best way to go about this, I'm just going to make one more cut a little bit further out, and now I can delete these two edges, giving us a bit more space. I'm going to connect an edge from the kind of lower quarter of the circle down to the edge, and you can see that's kind of destroyed the topology here. But once again, if I just simply connect down here, I can fix that up. So as you can see, once I've cut this edge down here, what's happening is now it's got to flow up through here. So this is the point of trying to keep things low res at this stage, because even with smoothing on, this flows nicely. Like I was saying at the start, if you don't have the topology kind of blending into each other, it makes things a lot more difficult later on when you're starting to connect edges. So I'm going to connect one along here, and that's just going to slightly alter the smoothness of this other edge up on the top of the shoulder. So that's where I'll just go in and make some little tweaks. I'm just going to drag out an edge here. I'm going to connect that. I'm going to make some changes to this in a second, you'll see. Actually, I can pull this in like so. So now you can see from the perspective viewpoint, the topology is blocked out correctly, but before I go any further trying to create some smaller details and adjustments to this, I'm just going to make sure the curvedness on the side is accurate as well. So I'm going to select each ring at a time. And pull that out until it hits the edge of the blueprint. So to make things easier to see how this curve is happening, I'm going to put a symmetry on this. So I'm going to center the pivot to 0. Because we created the plane from the side earlier, it won't have that set up. And then add a symmetry to it. And this is where I'll start to kind of look at the proportions from all different types of views, just to see where things are kind of pinching. So you can see right now, if over here, things aren't lined up nicely. Oh, so you can see here, because I rotated that plane, it's rotated the actual symmetry on top. So I'm just going to copy that symmetry modifier and reset the X form on the object, and then simply paste it back over. Now it's properly snapped. So to make my life easier, what I'm doing here is I'm connecting off the spherical inner core, and I'm going to make this kind of come out at a T-junction rather than at a 45-degree angle from that point. It gives us an extra 2 edge loops to work with and to smooth things out for. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going from the top here, and I'm trying to determine if these shoulder pads actually come in at an angle a bit more like this from the head. So to do that, I'm just going to hide this stuff we've got going so far. Just kind of zoom out and take a look, and I can see there's like a very slight angle on it that I don't have. So I'm just going to grab these vertices and just rotate them out until it's this top edge is hitting and this bottom edge is hitting down on the corners. I know it's hard to read, but you can kind of imagine that there's the angle and then it goes flat. Pull this down a little bit more. Trying to get it exact. Now, for areas like this where it's already going on an angle, to adjust those, it's best just to turn on edge constraint and slide them up one at a time. It just prevents the curvature from being disorientated. So if I pull them in, you can see now we've got a little pinch. Whereas if I have edge constraint on, it just fixes that. And I'm just going to loop this around and connect it at these 2 points. I'm just trying to determine how I want this area here to kind of continue, because I can either do it 2 ways. I can either connect it along here, and I'll just demonstrate that with a flow connect, and then hope that things smooth, and I think that's going to work. Or, you know, you can try different things like cutting the edge out from here and altering the topology a little bit. But with this kind of softer edge, I think the best option is just going to simply be to add another edge loop through here. So I'll leave that for now and continue on. So now that I've got a very rough angle of how this is pulling out, I'm going to use this opportunity to start cutting in this detail in here, and then I'll just disregard the geometry on the outside. And I can just simply get away with connecting here, and because it's a square hard edge, if I just edge constraint bring this in, it should start to work. Now you can see that it's all smooth still. Just going to pull this in the center. Snap that to 0. Now I can drag out, and I'm just going to snap this perfectly flat using the X. Set this to 0. I can pull this up now. Just drag this up and in. And I'm just going to pull this flat. So once again, I do have up on the left here my reference image I'm using. So in this area, you can see that where it kind of pulls out, it's all relatively flat. There's a little bit of wobbling in the surface, and I'm going to get to that later on in the next lesson. So basically, you can see here, a lot of people, they try and model things, and what they do is everything they create is this kind of perfectly smooth surface. Whereas you can actually see on the object here, there's some handmade errors and kind of tooling detail that it doesn't look like it's been machined by, you know, say a robot. You know, there's that nice little bit of hand imperfections going on there, and I actually include that in the model itself, so I don't keep things perfectly sharp and laser edge like. Alright, now you notice it on the inside here, it's looking quite, how can I put it, it's not really a perfect sphere. So to just quickly set that up, I'm going to collapse the object as is, select these inside edges, this inside edge, and I'm just going to use the regularize tool and then drag this out to the first edge visible there. I think that goes out about here. Just like so. So one of the problems you can see here is that I'm not sure if having this edge all the way up here is actually going to be beneficial. So I might need to pull this down, and I'm going to kind of really, I think as I start to smooth this, I'm going to have to reconsider this area. But for now, I'm just going to try and keep the edges being displayed out a bit more evenly. So now I come to a point where it's like I need to decide whether or not I need to pull this edge loop out here and connect it down like so, and have the point snapping here like this, and then I can get rid of this, and this should now work better. But you can see what's happening is that we don't have the edge loop kind of flowing in here. So I'm going to connect that in, and this is where just little tweaks like this help a lot. And you can see by adding that regularize kind of loop in here, it's made things a bit easier to determine what's going on. So I'm going to select this opposite side again because we've made changes, and paste the symmetry back over the top. And I'm going to use the regularize tool on that inner border again. Now one last time I can delete the other side, knowing that this inside is kind of set up all evenly, and I'm going to work around that. So don't worry so much about how this kind of inner part here isn't perfectly aligned. I'm going to go in later on and connect that just so it is. Actually, I can do that now. I'm just going to pull it in a little bit more. This is not going to be a perfect circle anymore, but hopefully after I smooth things and add the edges and the kind of detail in that area, you're not going to notice. Now you can see here this whole part actually is pulled in a little bit, so I'm going to need to create that detail now. So I'm just going to go in, add a connection all the way up through here, target weld up the top. Now I can select all those faces, and looking at the reference from side on, just drag those in. Because we don't have blueprints from the top, I've kind of got to eyeball this area a little bit. So now we've got some more edges to kind of start getting these side angles right. I'm just going to go in and start tweaking them so it fits. And every so often when you hit a point that looks a little bit hard to understand, I go back to the perspective view and try and visualize how that's curving. And you can see I just need to pull this forward a bit more. There's a couple of little wobbles in the surface. You can see I'm actually selecting these two vertices as usual. Because I don't know if I'm selecting something underneath here, I just swap to the X-ray mode and then I can just kind of make those changes knowing that I'm not selecting anything I've worked on down the bottom here. So everything's nice and light at the moment. I'm just trying to set things up so that when they smooth, there's not going to be any pinching. And I'm going to move on to the next point now. And I'll start adjusting this a little bit later on. So I'm going to go back to the inside here, and I'm going to drag in, looking at the reference here, I'm going to drag in some of this detail on the inside. Knowing there's a little bevel there, so I need to make sure that when I pull it in, I create a small kind of angle and then pull it in again. So I'm going to do this from the perspective view, just looking at things obviously on my left-hand screen while I do it. I think I need to pull this in a bit more. And I need to make some adjustments here by pulling these points in. Trying to straighten this edge up here. And then on the reference, you can see it actually goes down a little bit just so that everything kind of intersects on this part. So I'm going to pull one more edge loop down. And that's kind of going to go a little bit underneath. Obviously there's no details here, so it's little bit hard to kind of preempt exactly how the topology needs to work, but I'm just trying to block out the proportions. And any of these little, lines that are being connected under there, I can go in later on and start getting those to be a bit more refined. Now also you can see there's a flat edge to this kind of shoulder brace thing. So I'm going to connect that now. And to do that, I'm just going to chamfer these two edges, these two lots of edges. And I can pull down here. You can see I'm trying to make all the edges kind of evenly distributed. Sometimes that's not perfectly possible, but I'm just doing my best to make sure that there's enough of a similarity in the spacing here, where there's not, because it is such a large curve, there's not areas that pinch because you've got two edges that are like close together like this. Alright, so now that I blocked this out, I'm just going to put a smooth modifier over the top of this surface, just to kind of see how things are starting to pan out. Now, because I've blocked out most of the topology here, once again, I'm just going on from like all different sorts of angles, trying to see if there's any weird distortions in the surface. And I can see here that these points are pulled out a little bit too far. So I'm just going to pull those in. See, this area is pulled out just a little bit much. And to fix up this area, I'm simply just going to connect this and let the topology wrap around like that. Now it's also quite apparent that this large rounded edge here is actually pulled out a little bit more. So if I pull this reference up, you can see there's quite a big difference between the angle this is being pulled in and it's coming out. So now I need to start factoring that in, and why mine currently isn't doing that. So the first thing to start with is obviously getting the side on right. And now I'm pulling this in because you can see on the reference here, this area here, how it snaps is going to hit to a point. Now, often this view here is kind of one of the most important views that I worked with when I was creating my original Iron Man, because it gave me a very good understanding of how the chest rounds out. And you can see little details like this here, where the edge just isn't kind of puffing out evenly. You can see from the top here, this edge is just a bit, it's overlapping. All little details like that need to be considered. So now from here, I've got two choices. I can pull this out, and now you can see things are looking a little bit weird here, or I can pull these in as well. So I'm just going to do a little bit of both. It's just some little tiny adjustments here, but it actually makes a very big difference to how the lighting rolls off this front chest surface. Now this edge is straight in the reference, so I'm going to leave this point here. And I'm just going to pull out the inner part just a little bit, just to keep the rounding happening here. Alright, now you can see we've got a little underneath the neck area here, there's just a flat piece. So I'm just going to block that out by dragging out from the chest piece, and I'm going to detach it to make it separate, and I'll go in and refine this a little bit later once I start creating the little details like the metal pieces. Because things like this, the topology is less important. Because they're so hidden, and it's basically just a flat surface, it doesn't need to perfectly connect with everything else in the model. Even though if I was working on the film version, it would, because you never know if there's going to be cutaway parts. But to save time, for me personally, on something like a project like this, I just keep things simple. So just before I extend that piece out, I'm going to finish off the roundness on this kind of inside part here. By pulling that in, and I'm just going to connect it. Now I'm just going to make sure from side on that I've got the height right on that. So once again, because the blueprint's a little bit low res, I'm just kind of hide that and make sure that it's got the right depth. And it looks like I've actually gotten where this point is coming off just a little bit wrong anyway. Try and keep this flat. And now it looks like there's a metallic piece that comes off of that. So I'm going to grab these three edges and drag them back. And with edge snap turned on, just going to fix that angle up. And simply try and rotate this into place. I can just do some scale adjustments if I want. Okay, now I'm going to connect through these edges all the way to the base, and I'm going to delete the inside edge that's been created there, just so that that becomes a separate piece. And now I'm going to actually detach this. I can copy the symmetry and smooth modifier from the previous object and paste it onto this one. So I can see from the reference, this is actually very flat. So this is going to help me to dictate how round this inside edge is. So I'm going to get this piece flat, and then I'm going to move the edges from the main chest piece to fit that. You can see here if I pull this down, pull this up a little bit. Looks like I've gone just a little bit too far back. Slide this up so it's a perfectly flat angle. I'm just moving this until I don't see any difference between the shading on each polygon, which lets me know that it's becoming flat. So now I'm going to go and chamfer this edge. Actually, because it's creating a distortion here, I'm just going to connect around it. And I'm going to connect through because I'm going to make this a 90-degree snap. Like so. Now this is going to, when I add the turbo smooth, this is going to be nice and hard on this inside edge. So it looks like there's a bit of detail that kind of cuts up in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually cut this from the perspective view. It looks like it follows up from the, you can see this detail here. I might change this a little bit later. I'm basically going to cut it up like so. Connect those two. Delete this, and I'm going to pull this edge loop across. Spread this out, just gives me the chance to, you can see I'm starting to even up the polygons here. And even though this is a triangle, I'm going to leave it for now. And get rid of this edge loop. I'm going to connect this up here. And what this does is, when I you can see there's a bit of a orientation problem here. So when I weld this up and reconnect it, that edge is now perfectly flat again. So it's a cool trick. I can do it here as well. I can connect these two, I'll weld those two up, and then just connect through it again. And when I delete that, this surface is going to be more flat than it was. And I'm just going to make this silver. So I'm going to drag out the gold shader I've got here and just put the saturation down. And we're getting there. Okay, so now moving on towards the center here. I'm going to drag down and then out one, and I'm just going to delete this once again because this piece here is going to be just a blocking out piece. Once again, I'm going to delete this as a new object and paste over the top those two modifiers. This piece is just still slightly inside the width of from in between the neck and the shoulder pad. So using this kind of blueprint as a guide, I'm just going to pull this roughly back. And as usual, I'm going to pull it back with the same amount of topology as the piece next to it, just in case these two do actually need to meet. Just doing some very weak kind of light details here, just as a placeholder. I'm pulling these points out just because I think they're just a little flat. I'm trying to keep that rounded chest feeling. You know, that one of the problems with Iron Man is it's such a curvy model, but there's so many hard edges on it. So sometimes subconsciously to get away from having that pinched look, you end up making things more flat than they actually have to be. So for example, this is perfectly flat before I've made those adjustments, but in the reference you can actually see it's quite round, and the way the lighting's hitting off that suggests that it is quite kind of bulged out, and possibly more so than I've got it here. So that's why I've just taken a look. I'm just making little adjustments like that as I go. Okay, so it's nearly at the point now where I can start kind of blocking out the back, but just before I do, I'm going to create a couple of these neck pieces, and I did make some very heavy adjustments to those because it's hard to, this is where the blueprint kind of starts to not be very much assistance, because you can't actually see the shape and orientation of those behind the shoulder pads. So just going to be, once again, just a very rough placeholder, and then when it comes down to the next lesson where I start smoothing everything, I'll go in and put some more time on those. But basically, I can just drag that first neck piece up from the base I've created down here. So just before I do that, I'm going to take one more look. You can see I just need to pull these in. Pull this out a little. It's not so rounded as I first thought. So the first thing I'm going to do here is convert this to face, and that's going to select all these polygons I've just dragged out from that edge, and I'm going to detach it and make this a new object. And basically now, just because these edges kind of come in at a slight angle, I'm going to collapse this down, and later on, once I've made the adjustments to the scale here, I can go back and kind of reevaluate the shape. So basically right now I'm just trying to block out these edge joints. So these bottom two neck joints kind of come out a little bit further, but then this, as they go up, it starts to go in a bit more. So I'm just trying to figure out right now where abouts this neck sits kind of going back. Just very roughly snapping that to the back. Okay, so I'm going to align the back now, and I'm going to start blocking out the back of the mesh. do that, I'm just going to unfreeze these back planes here. Now I can change the front angle to the back. I'm just going to line those shoulder pads up, like so. So now you can see the head's in place, the width still matches, everything's lined up. Now I just need to start working on this piece here. So I can delete all the, I can hide all the front objects. I'm just trying to speed up the workflow a little bit now that you know how I was blocking out the front. And you can just follow along and see how I'm blocking out some of the topology on the back here. If I'm doing anything important or critical, I'll let you know. It's the same issue that was on the original piece with that rotation I placed. I've just had to go in and snap the reset the X form on this piece. So obviously the biggest orientation change in the topology is back here, where it kind of branches off from being straight into this rounded edge here. So to do that, I'm just going to cut an edge loop from this point. I'm going to delete this polygon and drag out from here. And then just like so, I've kind of gone in and altered the way that topology is aligned. Now I can go in and connect down like so and remove this, and just checking from the side that that's all okay. connecting from that edge that I just kind of realigned, and now the topology is flowing nice and evenly through this direction and through this area. And this is actually a very hard edge on the back of the model. So I might actually go in and make this have a third edge on the center here, which is very rare for me to do. And I'll only ever do that on areas that are like extremely sharply tooled metal. Everything else, you notice, I probably get away with having two edges to create the hardness, and maybe a third supporting edge, but nowhere near as close. So what I mean by that is I might go in and actually connect one more edge down here, and that'll let me create another edge coming off at an angle, and I can go in and kind of create that hard edge like that. But for now I'm going to leave it, and I'll just pull these together. I'm going to snap this like so. So basically I've got the concept art up on the back here that I'm looking at on the left, and I'm just going to now drag in this inset here, and then I'll get it to kind of create this tiny little bevel on the edge, and then I'll pull the geometry in. Scaling it in. The reason I'm scaling it is because you can see right now all the edges don't really fan inwards, and as you scale that, they actually kind of align a bit more correctly. Scale that in like so. I've got to pull this up until this point here. And now I need to drag out from here. I'm going to snap this. I have 2 edge loops. So now it looks like for this gold plated piece underneath, it's like a vent intake, so it actually goes in here. So just before I try and block this out, I'm actually going to finish off with the upper area here, and then I'll get working on this gold intake. Just taking a close look at the topology here because I'm not entirely happy with how that's kind of working. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these 2 edge loops. might need to play around with this a little bit more. You can see what I've done there is I've just kind of, rather than having this point connect here and then come out, now it rounds a little bit more, and it's doing something similar to what we've got on the front of the mesh in the neck intake. Let me just bring up the reference. In this area here. Alright, now I'm going to start working on the gold plate area. So the first thing I'm going to do is just drag out from the top. I'm going to weld these two. Basically, I'm just going to finish it off as a complete piece. Just very roughly. And then from here, what's the best way to do this? It's quite a tricky area. Okay. It's a very tricky piece, so I'm just kind of playing with how the topology is kind of flowing off of it into the outer edge, because I'm going to have to delete the inside here. So I'm just thinking it might be easier to delete this area now and kind of pull it in. Like so. And then when that kind of gap is created, it's easier to figure out how to connect them from that point. So just bridge these back up. And that's pretty much the perfect topology for something like this. So there's going to be a small adjustment made down here just to get this kind of rounding happening. So I'm going to go in, make a couple of small tweaks to the area. So even though the topology is low res, it's still quite a challenging concept to deal with. You know, you've got so many edges kind of flowing off of each other. You know, you've got a hard edge here, but then it rounds in, then it goes underneath, and then it kind of softens off down the bottom. Now I probably need to go in and add another edge loop on the center here. So when I do that, and you can see it's just connected a little bit off, I'm just going to simply drag it out. Drag it to the edge here, and then back in. And now I'm going to use this just to create a flat base to it. Just going to flatten this area off. All the little things like this, like the inconsistencies with how that's sticking out, I can just start to fix those. So what I've done here is I've selected the outer edge of this metal piece and I put a chamfer around it. So because when you chamfer it, you can see here we've got these square edges. As soon as I do that, it adds a second level of detail around. So now I've got an edge loop which I can go in, select it and delete it. None of the topology's changed, but it's set up later on for when I add the edges, add the supporting edge loops, it's going to flow around. So I'm going to unhide the rest of the model so far and just see where I'm at, see what pieces need to still be blocked out. I know there's the back of the head to do, we've got the back of the neck pieces to do. Maybe I'll go in and add a little bit of detail like this inset here. Just hide unselected on everything. Just going to look for little areas where I think I can probably go in, and so I'm just chamfering this off just to create. Actually, I'm going to keep it up here and I'll just flow connect up here, trying to keep the polygons a little bit more evenly distributed. I'm also going to need to go in and create a stand for the model to sit on so that when we render it, it doesn't look like it's just floating in space. I can actually have a floor and I'll just show you that over here. So that'll just be the stand underneath here. Might not do the exact same one, but it'll be something along the lines of that. So I'm going to keep the blocking out phase continuing on the back of the neck area. So to do this area, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the back. All I've got visible now is the neck piece and the back blueprint. But as you can see, once again, it's kind of hard to determine how things look with X-ray mode on, simply because I'm not able to see through the front of those pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select them. I'm just going to detach the front. I can always attach them later. I'm probably not going to make many modifications, but because it's only one polygon thick at this point, even if I do end up moving some of these vertices, I can simply just weld them again. So now you can see it's much easier to pinpoint how this is meant to look. Delete one half and paste the symmetry over the top again. So it looks like the neck piece kind of breaks off into two separate parts. You've got the front area and the back area. So I'm going to connect an edge loop going up each one of these points here. This one that I can't see, I'm just going to go in and do this here. I'm going to select these three, chamfer them to create the spacing, and now I'm going to go in, delete those like so. from the looks of the reference, it's quite flat on the back area. So I'm not gonna make it completely flat, but I'm just kind of leveling this area out a little. Now I'm also going to unhide everything, select the side blueprint, and then hide again. So I think what's happening here is it kind of branches out at this point and goes into a separate neck piece. So I'm just going to cut that in there. Shame for these two apart. So I'm going to come back to this area here, but just before I do, I might just go ahead and actually, you know what, I'll leave it for now. I was going to go in and add the kind of inner bevels on the back of the neck, but I might be making some heavy modifications to this area, so I'll just leave it for now. Just take one more look at things. Just going to head back to this kind of central reactor area, and I'm going to create the second bevel that goes inside. Swap this to the front view. Now you can see there's a second row here that I need to close. So I'm going to turn off the symmetry. Before I do that, I'll actually just weld this point up here. So now I'm going to jump back to the back of the head area and just try and quickly block that out, just to round out the lesson. I know there's a couple of smaller areas, and I think if I don't get to finishing the tiny details on the mesh, like just some of the riveting and little insets on different parts, I'll do like a third and final kind of 30-40 minute long lesson. So after this lesson, there'll be another 3-4 hours of content on the Iron Man, just to finish all these details off, get the base done underneath, and try and get the turbo smooth working on as much as physically possible. Then I'll go in and work on some little tiny refinements if needed, if that's not enough time to finish that off. Just mirroring this over to the other side. So right now I'm just taking a look at the back of the head in the reference here, just to determine how many kind of these panels there are that make up the back, and where the panels run along in terms of the angle. So right now you can see the angle we've got going here isn't exactly right. So to do these last two pieces, and obviously there's the connection that comes off the top of the head as well that I haven't cut in. Let me just show you that. You know, that you can see there's the line here that cuts through. I haven't cut that in yet. So I'm just trying to determine whether, like, how I'm gonna do that. So I'm actually going to detach this piece from the head. I'll copy all of the modifiers on top and just hide this. I'm just going to assign a separate material for a second here with 0 opacity, which is different from the X-ray mode because now I can see directly through. So the easiest thing to do here is probably just like what I just did, just rotate that topology until it's lined up with the crease, and then worry later on about going in up here and getting that topology kind of rounding out more. There's going to be some kind of trickery involved to get that rounding off nicely again. Very rough modifications here, and this is where you can see going in and doing such a high res mesh up the top might not have been the best idea, but you know what, at the end of the day, at least I get to show you the importance of keeping things as low res as possible. Now the cylinder I placed around the edge had 16 sides, and you can see that coincides with the topology I've got running around the head also. So that I know that when I perfectly align these points to the perimeter of that 16 side cylinder, it's going to create that nice perfect circular kind of edge running along here. Whereas if I say had 16 an uneven number of points leading up to here, I'd have to once again go in, probably loop around, and then use the the regularize tool to get that perfect. So it's easier just to set a cylinder on the inside with the same corresponding amount of edges and then line these points up to that. Right now I'm just trying to get that edge lined up to the reference. You can see here, I'm trying to create this one here. Just giving myself more topology to work with here. I'm going to connect that off, remove the inner right edge to create a square polygon. And now I'm left with another tricky situation. I've got a relatively flat area here, so there's a couple of ways I can terminate this. I can either put an edge loop up here and then connect along here and then try and even things out. Or if I'm confident in my ability to get this smoothing without adding more detail, I can actually remove some of the detail, even though we don't have the edge loops lining up anymore, and hopefully get away with that by removing these two. But knowing that this is a very complicated kind of area, I'm going to go with the more detailed approach and just require a little bit more fine tuning. So I'm going to connect up the top here and do a flow connect here, and then just start to balance it out with edge constraint turned on. Take a quick look at how this is going. It's not bad. It's a little bit, it's going to require a bit of tweaking. You can see that it's just bumping out a bit too much here. I'm going to need to round that. So basically what I mean is I'll just turn on screen mode and turn off edge constraint. It just needs to be a bit softer in how it kind of transitions from the hard edge. Now you can see that's looking a lot better. So if I zoom in and just show you the before and after. This whole area kind of needs to come out a little bit. I'm going to save that for the next lesson though. So now I'm detaching off this piece, and just to continue blocking it out, I'm actually going to go in and delete every second edge loop here to make things easier on myself. I'm going to add a symmetry to it and collapse this. Actually, before I do that, because this piece does go all the way to the center, and you can see I've continued this kind of beveled inset that goes on the top of the head, I'm going to have to cancel that at some point, but for now I'll just leave that. Basically, I'm going to go in, delete these two inside faces, and bring these back to 0. I'm going to make some small adjustments here. Just going to rotate this slightly. And now for this piece, I can actually get rid of that and start thinking about how rounded this back actually needs to be. Just very, very roughly slapping all this stuff into place here, because I just want to get a look of things kind of all sitting together, all the paneling. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with where things are going. Obviously there's a lot of detail to add at the higher resolution stage, but I just wanted to block out the overall proportions of everything so I can start to go in and cut the little details like that in. So in the next lesson I'm going to start off on this shoulder piece. That's the second biggest piece compared to the faceplate in terms of difficulty level. So I'm going to work my way kind of towards the easier parts of the mesh. So we're going to start with the shoulder pads, then I'm going to move on to creating this chest plate. Then I'll go in and do the back, and then I'll finalize everything by doing the neck and kind of underneath the chin and adding the depth to all the plates. Thanks guys, and I'll see you in the next lesson.